Good morning and welcome to the Shenkman Private Client Group Accountant Attorney Summer Webinar Series. This program is entitled New York Real Estate Post-COVID-19, Strategies and Perspective. For those who don't know me, my name is Jonathan Shenkman. I'm a financial advisor, portfolio manager, and an accredited investment fiduciary at Oppenheimer based in New York City. The goal of all my programs is to bring professionals together to help them better serve their clients. This is done by educating attendees on the latest topics in wealth planning and by encouraging collaboration between a client's attorney, CPA, and financial advisor where appropriate. My practice focuses on working with high net worth families, businesses, and not-for-profits. I manage individual investment portfolios, trust accounts, corporate retirement plans, and endowments to help my clients achieve their financial goals. I also handle their life, long-term care, and disability insurance needs where appropriate. In addition to the 20 to 25 events I run every year, I also do a fair amount of writing on the topics of investing and financial planning. You can read my work in Barron's, CNBC, Forbes, Kiplinger, the Wall Street Journal, the CPA Journal, Trust and Estates Magazine, and many other periodicals. After the program, I'll send out a link to all my publications where I publish my work. Today's program will focus on New York real estate post-COVID-19. This once-in-a-generation pandemic has had a tremendous impact on real estate around the country. In some residential markets, it had a positive impact with home prices skyrocketing in value. In some major cities, the value of office buildings have plummeted, leases were broken, and rent was lowered. New York City in particular has experienced a whole host of different effects since March of last year. To discuss what happened, where we stand, and where we're going, as well as some timely estate planning opportunities, we have 5 distinguished panelists. They are Benjamin Blumenthal, Principal Broker at No & Co., Joseph Greene, Principal and Member at Continental Abstract, Matthew Rappaport, Vice Managing Partner at Falcon, Rappaport and Berkman, Michael Shapot, Associate Real Estate Broker at the Shapot team at Compass, and Joshua Schlenger, Special Counsel at Sheppard Mullin. Before I turn our panel, just one more item. If you are a New York or New Jersey-based accountant or attorney, pay close attention. I'll be giving 2 codes during this program that you must write down. Tomorrow morning, you'll be receiving an evaluation form where you will need to insert both of these codes in order to receive credit. So please be ready for these codes. They will be given approximately at the 20-minute mark and at the 40-minute mark of this program. Okay, with those administrative items out of the way, let's jump into the program. First, I'd like to start with Joe Greene, who's a principal at Continental Abstract, a title company based in Long Island, but that does business all over the metro New York region. Joe, considering that you are involved in all types of real estate transactions, from single-family homes in the suburbs to large commercial buildings and everything in between, what changes to the market have you noticed since the onset of the pandemic?
I'll preface that by saying I'm not a broker. However, from the transactions that I've seen a large number of home sales in the suburban areas and a decline in residential condo sales throughout the city. Now that's changing a bit, but this has to do with what had happened at the onset of the pandemic. I think most would attribute this to the lesser need to be physically close to the workplace, combined with the need to have more physical space at a time when we're somewhat limited using public venues outside of the home. On the commercial end, for quite some time, I've seen a decrease in transactions relating to various types of commercial property, such as retail, hotel, and office space. More recently, those transactions have increased, though. However, the type of property which appeared to be relatively COVID-proof were multifamily, specifically cooperative buildings. I have several attorney clients who represent a large number of co-op buildings, and throughout the pandemic months, I've seen the consistent mortgage refinance transactions involving these buildings. Again, I'm not a broker, but I think it's logical to assume that banks in general have confidence when lending to a building with occupancy of long-term tenants, basically unit owners in these cooperative buildings, keeping these extremely high occupancy rates.
How are the logistics relating to the closing process in New York been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Okay, that's a big question. At the beginning of the pandemic, many didn't know how to handle the logistics of a closing where all parties were not physically present at the closing table. This created significant confusion on the residential side, where the vast majority of closings had been conducted completely in person. The commercial had been a mix to this point. At that early stage, parties were scrambling to pre-sign documents, send them to title companies to hold in escrow well in advance of closing. There are many challenges in doing so, specifically having a notary physically present to take acknowledgments when the signatory was not comfortable being in close proximity to another person. We saw many instances where title closers would stand outside the doorway to an individual's home, watch them sign, leave the documents on the stoop, and the closer would then take the documents and notarize them. A large factor that helped ease the remote closing process was the governor's executive order allowing for the use of audio-visual notarizations. This allowed for the signatory and the notary to come together using a virtual platform. Some of the requirements of this executive order are as follows. Both parties had to be physically present in the state of New York at the time of signing. The signatory would send the signed copy to the notary electronically. The notary would then sign and stamp the copy and email it back to the signer. The signatory would then send the original via overnight mail to the notary, who would then stamp the original. And in our case, we would then record the documents. So it definitely eased it, but it definitely created more of a process. Things have since leveled off to some extent. People are more comfortable being in close contact with one another again. However, they have become accustomed to pre-signing documents in order to avoid the need to attend the closing. This is most common on the seller's end, whereas it became more challenging for borrowers to pre-sign with large numbers of documents to go through and sign. Again, that's more on the residential end of it. The commercial end is shifted almost completely to remote closings. Rarely do I ever see a sit-down traditional closing for commercial purchases or mortgage financing transactions at this point. Whereas pre-pandemic, we saw a mix of sit-down versus escrow style. Even the banks and firms, which were always known to require in-person closings, Cullen and Dyckman being the one that comes first to my mind, have shifted to the escrow style closings. They've all adapted. They've all figured out how to do it to get documents signed in advance. I believe that much of the changes to the closing process will remain in a post-COVID world, being that they have brought a level of convenience to the parties involved and could be more easily accommodated due to many new procedures developed as a result.
As we begin to come out of the pandemic, what types of transactions should we expect to see significant increase of?
Okay, so I do expect, and again, prefacing, not a broker, but from what I've heard from my array of clients, is that there should be an increase in condo and townhouse transactions in the city. People are returning to work. Leisurely activities such as Broadway are starting to open, and then the city will go on, is what I've been told by all of my clients. More interesting, though, the moratorium on foreclosures is starting to ease. This should open up massive opportunity to investors to obtain properties through foreclosure sales. In my industry, we must be careful because when it comes to foreclosure sales, one small error in the foreclosure proceeding filed by the attorneys could create a major challenge to us and could ultimately result in a claim after the fact. So it's definitely good for the market. There's definitely opportunity. However, in the title industry, we have to be on guard for fraud and for problems in the foreclosure actions.
Great. Thank you, Joe. I'll now move the discussion to Benjamin Blumenthal, principal broker at No & Co., who specializes in finding and negotiating office leases primarily in the heart of Manhattan. Ben, what's the current state of supply and demand?
Thank you, Yoni, for having me this morning, and it's really a privilege and pleasure to be here. I remember starting out when you started out this group, I think over 10 years ago. So thanks for having me, and hope I can give you guys some value this morning. So to your first question about supply and demand, I mean, every market is a function of supply and demand. As you'd expect, the demand during COVID, and by COVID I'll talk about April 2020 until April 2021. Demand was mostly flat. Now, how do you measure demand for office space? I think the accepted metric that people were using was utilization. So how many people are coming into the office on a daily basis? That rate hovered between 10 and 15% throughout the year. There was activity. Again, 10% is still something, but demand was, I'd say, 10% of what it was prior to COVID. During that time as well, supply was accumulating, as you'd expect. Leases expired. Leases that were expiring were not re-upped. Some clients in the small to middle market decided to just kind of pack up for the time being, or weren't making long-term commitments. So there wasn't a whole lot of absorption taking place of space. So supply, as you'd expect, was mounting. And a glut of subleases were also continuously being added to the market. Some companies were cutting ties with their office completely, cutting ties with New York. getting rid of an office. Others were just testing their waters. So a lot of supply came on the markets, which you had for that year of April 20 to April 21 was an increasing supply and a flat demand, which obviously dragged on pricing and activity. Since April, and this is anecdotal, there are some statistics that came out that back it up, but just from what we're seeing on the ground here, we've seen a progressively stronger interest in getting space since April. From our perspective, the first wave of this demand that we saw began to close in the last 4 weeks. Here we've closed a bunch of deals, and some of them were even inside of 2 weeks, which in our business, to get a lease done from the time the client perks up and says, I need space, to signing 2 weeks is extraordinarily quick. So I think that definitely points to the momentum and the strength of the demand. What we're seeing is that the value deals, a lot of the subleases were great value deals, discounted pricing, good space, good plug and play value. Much of that is getting absorbed, as well as the direct lease space that's being priced appropriately to the market. That's really, as you'd expect, going to be the first stuff to get picked up. So we're definitely seeing that. And the sublease market that I spoke about earlier is definitely starting to thin. Many of the good deals, as I said, are getting scooped up. But also a lot of companies that had decided to test the waters with putting their space on the market are starting to pull their space as they contemplate a return for their employees to the office. I'd say if you look at when the best deals were, looking back, the deals that we did probably in October, November, December, January, the clients we represented then, I'd say now probably got the best deals. Landlords were extremely competitive then. But we're definitely seeing a little bit of tightening. The market's not back, but it's definitely not the bonanza it was for our clients a couple months ago.
What's changed in the office leasing market?
So I think, I can tell you what's driving the conversation. What's changed will take a couple of years to see once the dust settles and the cloud's clear from COVID as to how things shake out. Just a disclaimer, I'm not a journalist. You can find all those articles yourself. We just try to talk to our clients and the people on the street, and I'll kind of represent to you the conversations that we're having, maybe a little bit of a selection bias, but the small and mid-sized businesses that we're talking to definitely believe that the office is essential. There was a meme I saw the other day that someone said, every conversation I had with the CEO in December of 2020, he said, we're fully remote. In June 2021, we're looking to get into a space ASAP. So I think the office is definitely an essential part of many organizations. Some may have found throughout COVID that it's no longer necessary, but I think by and large, it's still a very important component of a business. And the jury's out on what the new normal will be as far as days in the office, work from home policies. But I think for most of the senior management people that we're talking to, the office is definitely something that they want to get back to. How and when that happens is uncertain. There's a palpable uptick that we're seeing in our office of activity, interest. I think Empire State Realty Trust, they're a public company, they own the Empire State Building. They reported on the recent earnings call that occupancy was at 15%. They painted it as an increase of 50% over the previous month, which was about 10 to 11%. Interpret that how you wish. But I think getting people back to the office by and large is still going to be a challenge. We've seen some false starts. I think big companies, tech, banks, are all having a tough time nailing down that return date and kind of reconditioning employees to get back to the office. So I think that'll continue to be somewhat fluid until the dust settles, but things are definitely going to evolve somewhat.
What are some of the new trends or expectations starting to take hold in the office market?
So I think one of the most interesting trends that we're seeing is before the pandemic, the growth of co-working and flex space providers such as WeWork or Knotel was very much in the market. Those providers, they always had kind of questionable business models, but there was really no question about the demand for those that product or service offering. Tenants like the flexibility, they like the amenities, they like the all-in-one pricing. So there was definitely a demand there. COVID definitely posed a challenge to their business models and whether those outfits could be profitable. But what we're seeing is a lot of landlords moving into that space. So what that means practically is landlords are offering a lot more full service deals, which means the space is wired, furnished, really plug and play. And they're also more open to flexible lease terms. So they'll do a 1, 2, or 3 year lease term to accommodate the demand for people in the market who may not necessarily have a clear enough picture yet of what their long-term space needs are going to be. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that landlords definitely go deeper into the demand to service them more and to be more competitive. And I think, there is, a lot of times for a long time, landlords were touting amenities, but I think amenities are a key focus now. I think companies are feeling that in order to get people back to the office, there's got to be some sort of draw, some sort of social draw, entertainment value, or something alluring about their office to get companies to come back and make it a unique place to be to work. And these providers provide more of like a centralized amenity service, with lounges, food and beverage, that type of thing. So it makes it easier for smaller companies to compete on that front because these providers kind of centralize that service.
What's the best approach when trying to figure out office planning, commitments, leasing space, etc.?
So I don't think much has changed. I think the best approach has always been, every company's always been looking at, utility cost, their identity when evaluating an office space. And I think that's very much true now. I just think the environment is a little bit shakier. So it's definitely important to focus and plan for your space, taking all the relevant considerations into place. However, today we are seeing a couple of those components are just still unclear. So my advice to all of our clients and anyone who comes to us to talk about this is really, make the best bet of what you need before committing, even at the expense of losing a window for a great deal. Ultimately, to not have a properly sized space or a space that's not functional for you, leases can be especially cumbersome and very economically detrimental to your business if they're not right-sized for your needs. So what I would encourage people to do is if you don't have a clear sense, if you're not really comfortable about making a commitment, for a lease term, try to explore your options to either kick the can down the road. Many landlords will entertain, short-term extensions, short-term renewals. Take a look at flex space. May require a little bit of a culture adaptation for many companies, but flex space is a great value for people that are kind of in a holding pattern. Or, if you are clear enough, try to make a long-term deal. It's now a great time to get a good deal. And if you feel comfortable enough about your needs and committing, there are definitely some great deals to be had in the Midtown office market.
Yeah, as you're talking, I think everyone could relate to this. I know my wife, they said that she doesn't have to go back. And me, they think that everyone's going to come back 5 days a week. I think they're in for a rude awakening because that's not actually going to happen. But, everything you said gives something to think about. But everyone that works in Manhattan is in the same boat here and trying to figure things out. So thank you very much, Ben. Before we continue the program, I'd like to pause for a brief moment to give the first code for accountants and attorneys based in New York and New Jersey who are taking this program for credit. The code is A10. Again, A as in apple, the number 1 and the number 0. One more time, A10. Next, I'd like to bring in Michael Shapot into the conversation. Michael is an attorney by training and an associate real estate broker that heads the Shapot team at Compass based in New York City. Michael, is the Manhattan residential market dead, and who are today's buyers and renters?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you again, Jonathan, for inviting me to participate. No, the Manhattan market is not dead. Anybody who has been in Manhattan in the past week, 2 weeks, can feel the enthusiasm and the vibrancy of Manhattan, and the residential real estate market is reflecting that interest. Who are today's buyers and renters? They are initially they were opportunists who were looking to take advantage of a down market. Today, I see people who work in the city, want pied-à-terres. Empty nesters from the suburbs are purchasing here. People have looked at this as an opportunity to get a piece of the apple when it was on sale. By the way, it's no longer on sale. Prices are back up. Interesting, who is not today's buyer? And those are foreigners. Foreigners are finally returning to the market because they can travel here, number one. And number two, the strength of the euro relative to the dollar is really bringing some foreigners in. I worked with some foreigners last week. So and finally, today's buyers and renters are people looking to are Manhattanites already who are looking to change their circumstances. They want more space, they want outdoor space, they want offices within their homes. They want something different. People recognize that their homes have warts, hairs, and pimples, and they're looking to change their living circumstances to better meet their needs.
Is an owner better off selling today or renting the property and selling next year?
I have this discussion all the time. Ben, does this sound familiar to you? We had the conversation very recently. You know what? It depends upon an individual owner's needs, and each owner has different circumstances. It depends upon the property's location. I think it depends upon somebody's strength and intestinal fortitude, whether they're willing to be a landlord in today's market. If God forbid you rent to a deadbeat, you can't get rid of them. So interest rates are going up. What's that going to do with to prices? There are all sorts of factors to be considered, and there's no one answer that fits everybody's needs.
This is a multi-part question. Are there certain price points or property styles or locations that offer value to the consumer? What characteristics of property will cause it to sell at a premium? And what characteristics will cause it to sell at a discount?
Great question. I will say that certain types of properties are on sale and certain types of properties are selling at premium prices. Very expensive properties are on sale because the demand hasn't been there. The Russian oligarchs haven't been in the market for 15 months. High-end billionaires row is truly on sale. So are the teeny tiny, very inexpensive apartments. So people who might work in the hospitality industry and might have some job insecurity, they're not buying. Nobody wants to live in a small studio apartment because they're fearful of the next lockdown. By contrast, properties that are in move-in condition are selling at a premium. The cost of renovation is going no place but up, and the hassle factor of renovation is way up there. Certain locations, I can tell you, are at a premium and others are at a discount. Midtown remains quiet, whereas Upper East, Upper West, Uptown, and the residential areas downtown are all booming. Certain qualities of properties are in demand. People want private outdoor space. People want in-unit laundry. They don't want to go to a laundry room and wash their underpants with their neighbors. Properties with home offices and separate spaces are in demand. For a long time, people's appetites for homes had large open spaces. Open concept living was very much in fashion. Today, with people working at home, students studying at home, everybody at home, everybody wants and needs their own little space. So maids' rooms, which were often combined into large eat-in kitchens, for example, maids' rooms are in demand because it can be a small office that people need to work at home and have privacy.
Looking into your crystal ball, where do you envision the residential market going over the next 12 months?
You know, Ben indicated that people are returning to work. As people return to work, as people get vaccinated, as theater opens, I think that the market will improve. I think that we will have a new mayor, which will inject enthusiasm into our city. Travelers are returning to our city. The hotels are crowded. The storefronts that have been vacant are coming to life. As office workers return, as the energy returns, people are going to be more comfortable shopping for homes, and people will be more comfortable living here, recognizing that Manhattan truly is the epicenter of cultural life, financial institutions, center for law, center for tech, center for medicine, and there is only one Manhattan. People want a piece of it.
Next question is one that's been hot for the past 18 months, as people have migrated out of the city, or at least that's what it seemed. So what do you see in terms of city versus the suburbs?
So I think that what this pandemic did was it accelerated people's desires to leave the city. So there are people who said, you know what, in the next year or 2 years or 3 years, we'll move our family out. And that's a typical sort of thing. Kids become a certain age, families leave the city. Pandemic hits, people are stuck at home. They say, you know what, why wait 2 years? Let's go now. And you had all of these people who migrated out of the city in April, May, June, July, to get their kids into school in September 2020. Well, I think that there aren't going to be that many people who still want to move from the city to the suburbs this year, next year, the year after. I think that the suburbs boomed for months, and I think that they've had their day in the sun. I think that the pendulum will swing, and first of all, I think people who went to the suburbs may not have sold in the city yet, and I think that they will return. I think that once they're working in their offices, once theaters open, once the Knicks start playing again next year, all good things are happening in the city, and I think people will be taking advantage of that. And in the suburbs, you know, it's a lifestyle difference, and I think that people will recognize where their hearts are. I will say this, you know, there's talk about there being a 50 cent per gallon tax on gasoline. What is that going to do to life in the city, life in the suburbs? I think it's sort of scary. My money's on the city.
Bold words. What words of advice can you offer a buyer or seller for residential real estate today?
So I think that people need to work quickly, meaning if they find something they like at a price they can afford and they're serious about it, don't play games. Jump in with both feet. Don't dip your toe in, because people who dip their toes in are going to be trampled. So work quickly. As quickly as you work initially, I think that you've got to be prepared for delays during the process. So due diligence takes longer. Management companies are overwhelmed, and it takes longer to get information out of management companies. Lenders are slower than they've ever been because they're not working, they're working remotely, they're not together. Lenders are slow. Scheduling of closings just takes a long time, and the process is what used to be a 60 to 90 day process to close the deal is now 90 to 150 days. We recently closed a deal very quickly. I don't know how we worked so quickly, but it was miraculous, and the parties were all pleasantly surprised. So words of advice: expect delays. And finally, the other word of advice is recognize that value is very subjective, and we are in a position of price uncertainty. And go in and understand what you can afford, what you can't afford, and play from there.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. Oh, I don't want to cut you off.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And now that we have a good overview of the New York real estate market, I'd like to shift to discussing leases, contracts, litigation, and best practices on these matters. For that, I'd like to bring in Joshua Schlenger, special counsel at Sheppard Mullin, based in New York, who has been inundated with this type of work over the past year. Josh, in your litigation practice, what impacts have you seen from COVID on the New York real estate market?
First of all, Jonathan, thanks for having me on. You mentioned at the outset of this CLE that this was a once in a generation pandemic. And, for complex commercial litigators like me, who have been dealing with real estate disputes, both in state courts and federal courts and bankruptcy courts, there's been a sense that, or at least there was a sense at the beginning of the pandemic, this is the moment we've been waiting for. This is an opportunity where maybe courts will, enforce these force majeure clauses, these clauses that, excuse obligations under commercial leases due to acts of God and other events beyond the control of the parties, or maybe they'll enforce these common law doctrines like impossibility of performance, frustration of purpose, to excuse tenants whose businesses are impacted by governmental regulations and by just lower demand for their services, to either abate their rent obligations or even to terminate their leases entirely. And I don't want to jump ahead too much, but we've actually been finding that generally that has not been the case, and courts have been tremendously unsympathetic to those arguments.
What legal justifications have tenants advanced for non-payment of rent or termination of the leases, and how have the courts reacted to these theories?
Yeah, so as I said at the outset, I guess category number one is the language of the contract itself. Commercial leases generally have these force majeure clauses that excuse certain obligations in the event of, like I said, these unforeseen events beyond the control of any party, acts of God, governmental restrictions, casualty, hazard. Tenants have invoked the language of these clauses to try to abate or their rent obligations under commercial leases, or cancel them entirely. And then we proceed to common law doctrines. There are these doctrines that where performance is rendered impossible by some event beyond the control of any party, that's a basis to excuse obligations under a lease. And then finally, like I said, there is this doctrine of frustration of purpose, that where the purpose of the contract is so completely frustrated, that's also a basis to excuse obligations under the lease.
Has it been easier for tenants to prevail in some courts but not others?
So tenants have not fared well at all. Since Governor Cuomo in New York, at least, handed down his executive order, basically closing down non-essential businesses, Executive Order 202.8 in March of 2020, tenants stopped paying rent, and then there was a further problem that the Chief Administrative Judge Marks actually closed New York courts to non-essential litigation. But over time, litigants, commercial real estate litigants, started coming to the courts arguing that their disputes regarding non-payment of rent or attempted termination of the lease, that those were actually essential disputes that needed to be litigated. So the court started considering them, albeit remotely. There certainly were decisions in which the tenants did prevail, at least in the trial court. I'm particularly thinking there was a decision handed down by Judge Deborah James in New York County Supreme Court in a dispute involving the Gap and the landlord at 170 Broadway, in which she credited these arguments. She credited the notion that the close down that took place in March of non-essential businesses, followed by the continuing restrictions on use in the sense of foot traffic and occupancy, actually constituted a casualty under the lease's force majeure clause. And she also credited the notion that performance was rendered impossible, that the purpose of the lease was so entirely frustrated. She also credited an argument by the Gap that because the commercial lease contained a use clause, which is those clauses are generally thought to protect the landlord by guaranteeing an income stream. But she actually applied it to the Gap's benefit to say that they could actually escape that lease and not pay rent. But apart from that decision and some other decisions, the courts have been overwhelmingly opposed to these doctrines. Just last month, the Appellate Division First Department decided an appeal which rejected the notion that these close downs constituted a casualty, because a casualty means physical destruction of the premises. And the same thing with a hazard. That's physical destruction or physical interference with use of the premises. And the notion of impossibility of performance, that was also rejected, because your classic impossibility of performance case is, for example, where you have a factory that's condemned after the lease is signed, or you have an agreement to rent costumes for a specific play that's going to be performed on a specific theater at a specific date, but then the theater burned down. Those are instances where I'm sorry, that's frustration of purpose, where the purpose of the contract, as set forth in the lease, is just entirely wiped out. And what the courts have been noting is that while there was this temporary closure and limitation of use, these premises were never permanently closed. Particularly with respect to restaurants, which were essential businesses, there was still the capability for takeout, or office space, which of course, a lot of offices were deemed non-essential businesses and were closed down for a period of time. But once they opened up again, even though the occupancy was limited, they were still usable. And the same thing for impossibility of performance. That doctrine requires a really high threshold. It's not enough just to say that it's financially difficult to comply with the terms of the lease. So by and large, the courts have been holding the tenants to the terms of the contract, recognizing that the landlords themselves are also suffering significant hardship. And just to your question about has it been easier to prevail in some courts rather than others, the answer is not really. I don't know if this was generally true. I thought initially that perhaps bankruptcy courts would be a more hospitable forum for some of these arguments, particularly where the tenant is the debtor. And while this isn't a New York case, in the Chuck E. Cheese case in Texas, the court actually rejected a lot of these doctrines. It rejected the notion that these governmental restrictions in COVID generally in the pandemic was a casualty, or that performance was rendered impossible, or the purpose was so completely frustrated. And actually that case I mentioned regarding the Gap, that's actually now on appeal to the First Department. And I think it was 2 weeks ago, the First Department panel, the judges just reamed out the Gap's lawyer. He couldn't even open his mouth before the questions started coming in. How is this a casualty? How do you fit in the force majeure clause? How do you fit into these equitable doctrines? So by and large, the leases have held to the landlord's benefits.
Running a little short on time, so I just want to try to get in two more questions if we could quickly. What other options have tenants pursued to avoid rent during the pandemic? And then I'll skip to some recommendations that you may have for people when they're drafting contracts. But what options have tenants pursued to avoid rent during the pandemic?
Yeah, so those force majeure provisions and those equitable doctrines, those were the natural, arguments that tenants gravitated towards. But a lot of commercial leases have options to allow tenants to terminate early for no reason, just merely by complying with certain procedures set forth in the commercial lease. And those have certainly been taken advantage of more in the pandemic.
Let's try to get in actually the last two, because Matt said he'll cede a couple minutes of his time. What do you expect in the coming months in New York landlord tenant commercial real estate litigation?
These cases, these non-payment of rent cases, these lease termination cases, they've been making their way through the courts. There was a high volume mid last year. They proceeded through the motion to dismiss stage, in which the courts have been testing the sufficiency of the allegations in the complaint. A lot of them reached summary judgment, and a lot of them have been decided on appeal. And while the statute of limitations hasn't necessarily run yet, the courts have, I think at least, handled the bulk of these cases. But there could be jury trials. There could be more cases that reach summary judgment, and of course, the appellate courts will continue to decide these cases.
What do you recommend landlords and tenants include in their real estate contracts going forward in light of what we experienced over the past year or so?
So while I'm a litigator and not the one preparing the lease, all I can say is, if you want this kind of pandemic to be lodged into the force majeure clause as a basis for non-payment of rent, do that. State it outright, so that your clients don't have to be pigeonholing themselves into casualty or even governmental restrictions. And a lot of problems have arisen in litigation because the force majeure clause actually carve out payment of rent as an obligation that's excused by force majeure. So commercial tenants may want to negotiate force majeure clauses that suspend not only other obligations in the event of force majeure, but also rent payment obligations.
Great, thank you so much, Josh. Before we continue the program, I'd like to pause one last time to give the second code for those who are taking this program for credit. The code is A15. Again, A as in apple, the number 1, and the number 5. One more time, A15. I will give final instructions on how to receive your credit at the conclusion of this program. Since we have many tax practitioners, estate planners, and advisors to ultra high net worth clientele on this webinar, I'd like to end this program with a segment on estate and tax planning strategies for clients with large real estate holdings. For that, I'd like to bring in Matthew Rappaport, Vice Managing Partner at Falcon, Rappaport, and Berkman, with offices in New York City and Long Island. Matt, if a family has experienced a serious devaluation of its real estate holdings due to COVID-19, what opportunities does that present on the estate planning side?
Yoni, thanks for having me. I appreciate joining everybody and my fellow panelists here who have done a great job. So I have a lot to follow up on. So, all right, it seems as if some of the valuations are recovering. So in the months since the pandemic began subsiding, when the vaccine became more widespread, some of the valuations have recovered. But if the valuation of a particular family's real estate portfolio is still down, you have a unique opportunity. I would call it the trifecta. You have low valuation, low interest rate, high exemption on both the federal level and the New York level, although as most folks know who are in the estate planning world, the New York exemption is half of the federal exemption. But that trifecta presents a very, very good opportunity. Folks had a lot of activity going on at the end of last year in fears that there would be a bill that either became effective retroactively or would be passed quickly after the Biden administration assumed office. That does not appear likely. But at the same time, the federal exemption has a built-in expiration date of December 31st of 2025, and it'll probably never get higher than this. So the opportunities are quite good. Even if valuations have recovered, they're still pretty good.
What are freeze partnerships, and do you think that they should be used more often?
Emphatic yes. So what are freeze partnerships? Freeze partnerships are structures in which you have a senior interest and a junior interest. Senior interest is held by the senior generation and family. Junior interest is held by generations after that first generation. So you have G1 holding senior, G2, G3, perhaps in a pooled trust or through a spousal life access trust, would hold the other interest in the freeze partnership. The way a freeze partnership works in a nutshell is the senior interest is frozen, hence its name. Senior interest is entitled to current capital value of its interest, but is not entitled to any capital appreciation above the value at the time of freeze. Instead, what it gets is it gets a cumulative annual preferred return tied to a market rate. So if the market dictates that real estate partnerships of this type are returning 6%, it'll be a 6% cumulative preferred return. And that you would seek to satisfy through the cash flow on the property. In this way, freeze partnerships allow you to quote unquote have your cake and eat it too. For many folks, the capital appreciation is not as important to them as they enter their 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, as the cash flow associated with the property and the ability to at least get a healthy amount out of any potential sale of a property in the portfolio. The freeze partnership in a nutshell allows you to do that. In the meantime, the junior interest is not entitled to a preferred return, but instead is entitled to any cash flow that is left over after the preferred return is satisfied, and that includes any capital appreciation on the property. So clients tend to like the concept that they get to keep their cash flow indefinitely to a certain extent, to the extent of the preferred return. And they like the idea that they get to move the capital appreciation out of the estate. That's good. What the issue typically is in freeze partnerships is trying to explain to clients exactly how they work and the reason why it's so powerful. It's typically a big gap in terms of trying to download all the knowledge into the client's head in order for the client to appreciate why the technique is so useful. And it has advantages over the other freeze techniques that a lot of folks are much more familiar with. Grantor trusts and the sales to grantor trusts, and GRATs, grantor retained annuity trust. But freeze partnerships in my mind are more advantageous because if you sell to a grantor trust, for instance, when the note has been exhausted, there really is no other convenient way. There are ways, but they're just not very convenient for a client to extract any further capital out of the trust and the assets that the trust now owns. As opposed to, right, in a freeze partnership, you can keep that preferred return as long as you hold the senior interest. Furthermore, when you sell to a grantor trust, whatever percentage that the senior generation retains, they also retain the appreciation on that percentage. In a freeze partnership, you can move all the appreciation outside of the estate. So there are certain advantages and reasons why I like the freeze partnership. And I think they should be more widespread, even though it's a tough barrier to explain it to the client. You have to try and get over that hurdle.
If an irrevocable life insurance trust gets used to its full potential, what is its utility for a real estate family, and why is life insurance so important for families holding primarily real estate assets?
So typically life insurance is groan inducing for everybody. I try to stress the reason for that is because you need to find a person who you can trust who sells it. And sometimes, as we all know, that's like finding a unicorn. But if you have the right person implementing it, or if you could build enough knowledge yourself to be able to cross-check anybody who might be involved on the client side, life insurance is the closest thing you have in estate planning to a magic bullet. The phrase using a life insurance trust to its full potential, in my mind, really means what you do is you're multiplying the annual exemption through what many people call crummy powers, which are annual powers of withdrawal that are meant to qualify as much of the premium payments into the trust for the annual exemption as you possibly can. So the annual exemption, as the estate planners know and the tax folks know, the annual exemption is $15,000 per donor per donate. There have been several proposals to try to change it, but that's currently the way it is. In addition, the case law is very, very favorable. In Estate of Israel McKell, which was, I believe, the most recent one to expand further the interpretation of how the annual exemption gets used in a trust, the beneficiaries with the power had to go to a Beth Din to basically adjudicate whether or not they were able to exercise the power. And the tax court said that was still okay and was not an unreasonable restriction on the power of withdrawal or not an unreasonable condition. So in the State of Israel McKell, it was an Orthodox family that had many, many different beneficiaries. I think the number was 50, believe it or not. You multiply that by the allowance in the annual exemption, and you get a lot of life insurance premium that you can pay without using your lifetime exemption at all every year. It's very, very powerful. And the reason why real estate families need life insurance is because real estate families are almost always illiquid. And especially when you have an estate going, what you'd rather not do is you'd rather not be forced to sell any properties in the portfolio. I mean, for instance, if somebody died during COVID and did not have the liquidity to pay the attendant taxes, you really kind of have two broad options. The first one is you raise liquidity through sales. And the second is you go with a 61-66 arrangement in which you take a long-term interest-bearing lien from the IRS effectively on the assets in the real estate portfolio, and you pay down the estate taxes over time. It's a strategy, but it's not ideal. It may crimp your ability to borrow against the property. And generally, you want to be able to get that, you really want to be able to get that obligation off your back as soon as possible. So the insurance provides liquidity on that front. But in addition to taxes, liquidity is important for estate equalization. I mean, for instance, if you have multiple children who are in a family, some of them work in the business and some of them don't. If you're bequeathing the business, or in this case, the real estate portfolio, down to the next generation, you want the ability for the children who are not in the business to be able to have cash. Or alternatively, you'd want the children who are in the business to be able to buy out the children who are not in the business of their stake with cash. Where do you get that cash? Typically from life insurance. So it has so many different uses. And I feel it gets a bad rap because the people who are involved in the industry, a lot of the time. But if you can find somebody trustworthy, it's incredibly powerful. It should be used more often, in my estimation, even though it is pretty widespread as is.
What do you typically say to families who are averse to incurring the real estate appraisal and business valuation costs associated with most effective estate planning for real estate owners?
Ultimately, so I learned the lesson very early on that you have to explain to clients who are doing this for the first time, you have to explain those costs up front. Because I've had times in which the real estate portfolio is so extensive that the appraisal and valuation expenses have actually exceeded the legal expenses. But here's typically what I tell people, especially people who are looking to scrimp on those costs. Those are the folks, the real estate appraiser and the business valuation specialist, who will be doing a discount study. And discounts are just big in every single estate planning technique for real estate. It's one of the bread and butter techniques that you're using in order to plan effectively and make sure that you can get as much value out of the estate as possible, the biggest bang for the buck. And discounts are so powerful because they're on percentages. They're not on flat dollar amounts. There's no cap on the amount of dollars you can move out of the estate in book value based on the usage of discounts. So here's what I tell people about securing appraisals and valuations. It is a lot less expensive to make the outlay for the highest credentialed and the most experienced professional you can find, and the person who has the most chops in defending before the IRS and the state level auditors. It is cheaper to pay those people up front than it is to try and have somebody defend a subpar report for either real estate appraisal or valuation upon audit, or otherwise have to formulate arguments as to why the figures in those reports ought to be sustained. And it is much more comforting to understand at the time that that audit comes that you have somebody who is locked and loaded, who is experienced, who understands what it means to go on the stand and endure cross-examination by an IRS litigator. You want that person to be the person preparing the report. You don't want somebody who's going to be a deer in the headlights in that moment. That's really what you're paying for. And when you put it into that perspective, it's an excellent investment, just as good as the other professionals, the lawyers, the accountants, and the other specialists that are involved in the estate planning process. Those persons are equally important.
Have you seen the bill winding down through its way through Congress that has been co-sponsored by Bernie Sanders? If passed, what effect would this bill have on estate planning in the real estate world?
So have I seen it? I've seen it. Have I seen the Greene book, which was released right before Memorial Day, which they blessed our Memorial Day weekend with the Greene book. The Greene book on the estate and gift side has 2 pages of content. The crazy thing is that they are 2 seismic pages. It would basically propose repealing the step up in basis and saying that either death or gift would now be a recognition event. They were unclear about whether or not the recognition event would be for transfer taxes or for income taxes. I'm assuming what they meant was income taxes. So what they're saying is the step up in basis would actually occur, but it would occur by virtue of a recognition event, not by virtue of Section 1014, which currently allows a basis adjustment without any imposition of the income tax. Of course, the estate and gift tax may apply if the estate is over the exemption. This would be a seismic change. The other seismic change that they were talking about was the notion that there really wouldn't be an exemption for appreciated assets anymore. And they didn't go into detail about the interplay between transfer taxes, and by that I don't mean real estate transfer taxes. I mean estate, gift, and generation skipping transfer taxes. They don't go into detail about how transfer taxes would interact with income taxes. But what they said was, we would allow $1 million of appreciated assets to pass on a carryover basis with no recognition of taxes. And presumably that's for family homes, family farms, and ranches and things like that. But once you exceed that threshold, all of a sudden you're paying tax on transfer. That's crazy. What's the chances of it passing? Business-wise, right? If I'm being a salesman, the chances are, oh, you should be very cognizant of this. If I'm putting my political science hat on and I'm saying, what realistically, if I were a betting man, would I say that passes? No, because I think that the margins in the Senate and the House of Representatives for the Democrats are too low. But at the same time, the reason you should be cognizant of this is not because it might pass soon. I think the odds of that are quite low. But I think that what you should do is you should be very cognizant of the idea that this is what the American left is thinking about the way that the tax system should work. And if it doesn't take effect today, it may take effect in a future regime. You should just keep a close eye on the way that they're framing this, because it may resurface again. And if it does, you should at least have your strategies lined up. The reason why it was good we mentioned freeze partnerships is because that one would not go away, and it would only become more powerful relative to the other options in the event that a bill like this actually did pass.
Great, thank you so much, Matt. It appears that we're at time. So what I want to do is thank our panelists. Thank you, Joe, Ben, Michael, Josh, and Matt. If anyone has any specific questions, new business opportunities, any other issues they'd like to discuss, please feel free to reach out directly to the speakers or myself where appropriate. I'll be sure to include their contact information in the follow-up email to this program. 3 more quick items before I let you go. First, in order to receive credit for this program, please be sure to fill out the evaluation form, which will be sent out tomorrow morning. The evaluation form will ask for the 2 codes, which I've given you, so be sure to input them where indicated. It is imperative that you fill out this form first thing tomorrow morning to ensure that you will receive credit. The certificate will be emailed to you within a week and will be from ACE Seminars. So be sure to keep your eyes open from that email from ACE Seminars. Very important. Second, my next program will be on June 29th and is entitled Pooled Plans, the 401k plans you didn't know existed, featuring Mark Sywin, Regional Vice President of Transamerica. You will receive an invitation to this webinar and all of my upcoming sessions in the coming days. I hope you can attend. Finally, be sure to take 30 seconds to fill out my survey at the end of this program. It helps me improve my webinars and provide timely and interesting content to attendees. I thank you in advance. And with that, this concludes today's session. Please stay safe and healthy. Have a wonderful day, everybody.